The rope creaked against weathered wood as Patience hauled the bell cord with mechanical precision, each pull sending bronze thunder across the Kentucky countryside. At the stroke of midnight on October 15th, 1831, she would transform that same rope into an instrument of justice that would leave her master swaying 40 feet above the ground. This is the story of how one enslaved woman turned a church bell into a gallows and a holy sanctuary into a scene of calculated revenge. The Methodist chapel sat on a hill overlooking the tobacco fields of Jessamine County, its white clapboard walls gleaming like bones in the moonlight. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of beeswax candles and old hymnals, while outside, autumn wind rattled shutters with skeletal fingers. The bell tower rose another 20 feet above the chapel roof, accessible only by a narrow ladder that most parishioners avoided. Too steep, too dangerous, they said. Perfect for secrets. Patience had been ringing that bell for 3 years, ever since Master Edmund Hartwell decided she possessed the right combination of strength and punctuality for the task. Every Sunday morning at 8, every evening at 6, every midnight on the 1st and 15th of each month to mark the time for travelers. She climbed those rungs in darkness, in storms, in sickness, because slaves who failed their duties found themselves sold downriver to cotton plantations, where life expectancy measured in months, not years. The Hartwell plantation sprawled across 800 acres of prime Kentucky soil, where burley tobacco grew thick, as redemption and twice as profitable. Master Edmund ruled his domain with Methodist fervor and businessman's calculation, believing that slavery was God's will and profit was God's blessing. His wife Martha supervised the household with Christian efficiency. Their 4 children learned righteousness at the breakfast table, and their 18 enslaved workers learned survival in the quarters behind the main house. What they didn't know was that Patience had been teaching herself to read using the Bible left in the bell tower, studying scripture by candlelight during her midnight vigils. The same book that justified their bondage also spoke of Moses leading his people from Egypt, of David slaying Goliath, of justice rolling down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. From the Journal of Circuit Judge William Morrison, October 10, 1831, visited Hartwell Plantation. Impressive operation. Master Edmund expressed concern about maintaining discipline among his workforce, suggested stricter measures. That concern had manifested 5 days earlier when Patience's younger brother Samuel was caught with a piece of paper bearing his own name in careful letters. The punishment was swift and public. 20 lashes for unlawful learning, witnessed by the entire enslaved community as a reminder that knowledge belonged to white folks alone. Samuel's back would heal, but the message carved itself deeper than any whip could reach. Standing in the bell tower that midnight, Patience tested the rope's strength with calloused hands. The hemp was thick as her wrist, strong enough to lift a 400-pound bell, certainly strong enough to support a man's weight. She had measured it carefully, calculated the drop, studied the mechanics during weeks of planning that masqueraded as faithful service. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Master Edmund made his rounds every midnight when the bell tolled, checking the stables, the smokehouse, the workers' quarters. A man of rigid habits, he always climbed to the bell tower afterward to ensure she performed her duties correctly. Tonight, she would be waiting with more than punctuality. Death comes for the righteous and the wicked alike. At 11:57, she heard his boots on the chapel steps, then the creak of the door, then his heavy breathing as he climbed toward her. Master Edmund was 43 years old, soft from prosperity, unused to physical exertion. The ladder rungs groaned under his weight as he ascended toward what he believed was another routine inspection. But routine had ended the moment Patience decided that some chains could only be broken with blood. What drives a person to cross the line between suffering and revenge? When does Patience become something else entirely? As Master Edmund's head appeared through the tower opening, Patience held the rope steady and prepared to answer those questions with her own hands. The bell would toll 13 times that night, once for each year of her enslavement, and the 13th toll would announce not the hour, but a reckoning that had been decades in the making. Master Edmund's breathing echoed in the confined tower space as his bulk settled onto the wooden platform, wheezing from the climb like a bellows working overtime. The scent of his pomade, mixed with tobacco smoke and righteousness, created an atmosphere thick enough to choke on, while moonlight filtered through the bell housing to cast prison bar shadows across the floor. This was the moment when 37 years of careful planning would either succeed or end, with Patience swinging from a different kind of rope entirely. Edmund wiped sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief, the letters E.H., embroidered in gold thread that cost more than most slaves earned in a lifetime. He had inherited this plantation from his father, along with the Methodist convictions that justified owning human beings and the business acumen that made it profitable. The bell tower represented both aspects of his character, a symbol of Christian faith that doubled as a watchtower for maintaining control over his property, human and otherwise. Patience remained motionless in the shadows, the rope coiled in her hands like a serpent awaiting its moment to strike. She had practiced this positioning for weeks, learning how to stand where the moonlight wouldn't reveal her presence until Master Edmund turned his back to examine the bell mechanism. He always checked the same things in the same order: the rope's condition, the bell's mounting, the ladder's stability, methodical habits that would become his downfall. The Hartwell family had owned Patience since birth, purchasing her mother Ruth from a Virginia plantation before she was old enough to remember freedom. Ruth had died giving birth to Patience's younger sister, who lived only 3 days before joining their mother in the slave cemetery behind the tobacco fields. Growing up, Patience learned that grief was a luxury slaves couldn't afford, that tears belonged to people with time for mourning, and that survival required burying emotions as deep as the unnamed graves that dotted their world. From the Jessamine County Property Records, 1828, Bill of Sale, Negro woman Patience, age 21, sound body and disposition, experienced in household duties and field work. Sold by estate of Thomas Hartwell to Edmund Hartwell for the sum of $600. But Patience had always been different from other enslaved workers. While they accepted their fate with the resignation born of hopelessness, she studied their oppressors with the intensity of a scholar. She learned Master Edmund's schedule down to the minute, memorized his preferences and prejudices, cataloged his weaknesses the way other people memorize scripture. Knowledge was the only currency slaves could accumulate without suspicion, the only weapon that couldn't be confiscated during searches. The bell rope hung between them now, innocent and functional, its true purpose hidden in plain sight. Edmund stepped past her hiding spot, close enough that she could hear his labored breathing, smell the brandy on his breath from his evening constitutional. He always drank before these midnight inspections, claiming it helped him think clearly about plantation business. Tonight, the alcohol would slow his reflexes just enough to tip the scales in her favor. Some nights demand more than prayer. Patience had been 8 years old when she first understood what it meant to be property. Master Edmund's brother-in-law had visited from Louisiana, bringing stories of sugar plantations where slaves worked themselves to death in 18 months. The visitor had examined Patience like livestock, commenting on her build, her potential for bearing children, her estimated market value. That night, she lay awake in the quarters, listening to her mother weep quietly in the next bunk, understanding for the first time that her body belonged to someone else, and her future could be sold for the price of good horseflesh. The knowledge had festered for 16 years, growing stronger with each injustice witnessed, each family separated, each drop of blood spilled for the crime of seeking basic humanity. Samuel's whipping 5 days earlier had been the final grain of sand that triggered an avalanche decades in the making. Edmund bent to inspect the bell housing, his back turned toward her concealment. This was the moment she had visualized 1,000 times during sleepless nights in the quarters. The rope lay within arm's reach, the noose already prepared with a slip knot she had practiced tying in darkness until muscle memory made it automatic. One fluid motion would loop it around his neck before he could cry out for help. What separated this night from all the others when she had climbed these rungs, consumed by rage but lacking resolve? What transforms a person from victim to executioner in the span of a heartbeat? The answer lay not in sudden inspiration, but in the slow accumulation of certainties. That justice would never come from courts that didn't recognize her humanity. That freedom could never be earned through good behavior, when the system itself was the enemy. And that some acts of resistance required crossing lines that could never be uncrossed. Master Edmund straightened from his inspection, turning toward the ladder for his descent back to the safety of his world. But safety was an illusion, about to shatter like glass in a hurricane, and Patience stepped from the shadows, with 37 years of fury flowing through her fingers as they closed around the rope that would write the final chapter of his story. The hemp scratched against Edmund's neck, like the whisper of judgment, as Patience pulled the noose tight in one swift motion, cutting off his startled gasp before it could become a scream. His hands flew to his throat, fingers clawing at the rope with the desperation of a man discovering that his authority meant nothing to gravity, and gravity cared nothing for the color of his skin. This was the crossroads where Patience would either claim her freedom or forfeit her life, with no middle ground between salvation and damnation. Edmund's eyes bulged with shock and terror as he realized his situation. The woman he had considered property, barely human, had just become his judge and executioner in a courtroom 40 feet above the Kentucky soil. His feet scrambled for purchase on the wooden platform, but Patience had positioned herself perfectly, using his own weight against him as she backed toward the bell mechanism where pulleys and leverage would do what muscle alone could not accomplish. The silence of the moment felt profound after years of hearing Edmund's voice issue commands, complaints, and condemnations. Now his throat produced only strangled gasps as the rope bit deeper into flesh that had never known hardship beyond the mild discomfort of too much brandy or an overcooked meal. For the first time in his life, Edmund Hartwell was experiencing powerlessness, and the lesson was being taught by someone he had never bothered to consider capable of teaching anything. Patience had studied the bell tower's mechanics during countless midnight vigils, learning how the rope and pulley system multiplied force to lift the massive bronze bell. Tonight, those same principles would serve a different purpose. She wrapped the loose end of the rope around the bell housing's wooden beam, creating a crude but effective hanging apparatus. Edmund's weight would do the rest, physics becoming the impartial arbiter of a justice that human law had refused to provide. From the personal diary of Dr. James Fletcher, October 16, 1831. Called to examine body of Edmund Hartwell, death by hanging, though circumstances remain unclear. Rope burns on neck, consistent with struggle. No signs of forced entry to plantation grounds. The transformation happening in that tower transcended simple revenge. Patience was experiencing what abolitionists would later call the moment of liberation. Not just physical freedom, but the psychological breaking of chains that had been forged in childhood and strengthened by years of systematic dehumanization. Every breath Edmund struggled to take represented a breath of agency she was claiming for herself. Every second of his terror, a payment against the lifetime of terror he had inflicted through the casual exercise of absolute power. Below them, the plantation slept in ignorance. Martha Hartwell lay in her feather bed, dreaming whatever dreams came to women who built their comfort on others' suffering. The children slumbered in their nursery, innocent of their father's sins, but destined to inherit the moral debt he was now paying in full. In the quarters, 18 enslaved human beings lay on corn-husk mattresses, unaware that their world was about to shift on its axis. But revolutions begin with individual acts of courage, and courage often wears the mask of desperation. Patience felt no triumph in this moment, only the terrible clarity that comes when survival demands crossing lines that can never be uncrossed. She was not a killer by nature, but nature had been perverted by a system that turned human beings into property, and then wondered why property sometimes rebelled. Edmund's struggles were weakening now, his movements becoming less coordinated as oxygen deprivation affected his brain. His eyes, once hard with the certainty of his superiority, now pleaded with the same desperation Patience had seen in the faces of slaves being sold away from their families. The irony was not lost on her. The man who had never shown mercy was now begging for it from someone he had never considered capable of granting or withholding anything. Blood makes poor mortar for building kingdoms. The bell rope creaked under the strain, fibers stretched to their limit but holding firm. Patience realized she was holding her own breath, as if Edmund's struggle for air had somehow synchronized their final moments together. This intimacy felt obscene. To be so close to another person's death, to feel responsible for the precise moment when life departed the body. Yet this was the intimacy slavery had always demanded, forcing human beings into relationships that violated every natural boundary between souls. Time moved strangely in the tower, seconds stretching like hours, while Patience watched the life drain from her oppressor's eyes. She found herself remembering Samuel's tears after his whipping, the way his young shoulders had shaken with sobs he tried to muffle so the other children wouldn't hear. That memory steeled her resolve as Edmund's movements became spasmodic. Then still, when it was over, when the last breath had rattled from his throat and his body hung limp as a scarecrow in a harvested field, Patience felt a strange emptiness where she had expected satisfaction. Justice had been served, but it tasted like ashes and smelled like death. And she understood that some victories exact a price from the victor's soul that can never be fully paid. The hardest part was yet to come, climbing down from the tower, walking past the sleeping quarters, and beginning the most dangerous performance of her life, pretending to be the same obedient slave she had been yesterday morning, while inside her chest beat the heart of a woman who had just committed the ultimate act of rebellion. Morning mist clung to the Hartwell plantation like guilt made visible, swirling around tobacco rows and creeping up the chapel steps, where worshippers would soon discover that their bell would not call them to Sunday service. The scent of wood smoke from cooking fires mixed with dew-dampened earth and the metallic tang of death that seemed to permeate the air around the tower, though only Patience could detect that last element among the familiar morning fragrances. The discovery would come at 7:30 when young Timothy Morrison arrived to light the chapel lamps, forever changing a 12-year-old boy's understanding of mortality and evil. Patience had spent the hours before dawn in the quarters, lying on her straw mattress with eyes wide open, listening to the familiar sounds of slaves, beginning another day of bondage. Samuel stirred in the next bunk, his back still striped with healing welts from his punishment, while around them, the soft murmurs of morning prayers created a backdrop of faith that seemed both precious and futile in light of what she had done. The irony struck her forcefully. Here were people finding hope in Scripture, while their oppressor hung dead from the rope of a church bell. Sleep had been impossible, not from guilt or fear, but from the strange exhilaration of having acted after so many years of enduring. Every fiber of her being hummed with nervous energy, as if lightning had struck her soul and left it permanently charged. She had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, transformed herself from victim to agent of justice, and the magnitude of that transformation left her feeling simultaneously powerful and terrified. The plantation's routine proceeded normally in those pre-dawn hours. Cook fires were lit, animals fed, the endless cycle of labor that sustained the Hartwell family's prosperity. Master Edmund's absence went unnoticed initially. He often slept late after his midnight inspections, fortified by brandy and the satisfaction of finding his property secure. Martha Hartwell, took her morning tea in the parlor, reading from a devotional book that spoke of God's providence while remaining carefully silent about God's justice. From the Jessamine County Sheriff's Report, October 16, 1831. Body discovered by Timothy Morrison, age 12, son of neighbor William Morrison. Child found victim suspended from bell rope, approximately 7:15 a.m. Immediate examination revealed death had occurred several hours prior. Young Timothy's screams shattered the morning calm like a stone through stained glass. The boy had climbed to the tower to investigate why the morning bell had not rung, expecting to find mechanical failure or perhaps Patience asleep at her post. Instead, he discovered Master Edmund's corpse hanging from the very rope that had called the faithful to worship for 23 years. The child's horror echoed across the plantation grounds, carrying news of calamity faster than any rider could have spread it. Patience was drawing water from the well when Timothy's cries reached her ears. She allowed herself a moment of genuine surprise before arranging her features into the expression of shock and concern that the situation demanded. Around her, other slaves dropped their morning tasks and looked toward the chapel with faces that registered confusion, then understanding, then carefully controlled reactions as the implications became clear. The performance began immediately. Patience ran toward the chapel with the others, her acting so convincing that she almost believed her own bewilderment. She gasped appropriately when she saw the crowd gathering, covered her mouth in horror when someone mentioned Master Edmund's death, and fell to her knees in apparent prayer when the full scope of the tragedy became apparent. Years of enforced subservience had taught her exactly how slaves were expected to react to their master's demise, with shock, grief, and profound concern for their own uncertain future. Martha Hartwell's wails could be heard from the main house as news of her husband's death reached her. The sound carried across the tobacco fields like the cries of a wounded animal, raw and primal and utterly human, despite everything else that separated mistress from slave. 4 children would grow up fatherless, a woman would face widowhood, and 18 enslaved human beings would face the uncertainty of being sold to new masters who might prove even crueler than the dead man swaying in the tower. Justice comes with costs. No one calculates in advance. Sheriff William Donovan arrived within 2 hours, his horse lathered from hard riding across county roads still muddy from autumn rains. He was a methodical man who approached investigations like mathematical problems, gathering evidence piece by piece until patterns emerged from chaos. The sight that greeted him in the bell tower was both simple and complex. A man hanging from a rope in a space accessible only by ladder, with no signs of struggle beyond the obvious desperation of his final moments. The initial examination suggested suicide, a conclusion that provided convenient closure for a community unprepared to contemplate alternative explanations. Master Edmund had been drinking heavily in recent months, some said. Financial pressures from falling tobacco prices had weighed on his mind. Perhaps the burden of maintaining Christian principles while practicing slavery had finally broken his spirit. These theories offered comfort to white folks who needed to believe that their world remained fundamentally secure. But Patience knew the truth would not stay buried in convenient explanations. Investigations had a way of uncovering inconvenient facts, and she had left a trail of evidence that would eventually lead back to her. The question was not whether she would be discovered, but how long she could maintain her performance before someone noticed the inconsistencies that always betrayed deception to careful observers. As Sheriff Donovan began questioning the slaves about their master's state of mind and recent behavior, Patience prepared for the greatest acting challenge of her life, convincing a trained investigator that she was incapable of the intelligence, planning, and resolve necessary to commit the perfect crime. Sheriff Donovan's boots struck the chapel floor with military precision as he arranged the slaves in a line for questioning, his weathered face betraying no emotion, while his sharp eyes cataloged every nervous gesture and averted gaze. The scent of beeswax candles mingled with the lingering aroma of death from above, creating an atmosphere that made confession feel like the only path to absolution, while outside the windows, autumn leaves rustled secrets that would never be spoken aloud. The sheriff's interview strategy would either expose Patience as a murderer or establish her as just another piece of plantation property, too simple to conceive of killing her master. Each slave stepped forward when called, answering questions in the deferential tones that white authority demanded. "Yes, sir. Master Edmund seemed troubled lately." "No, sir. Never heard him speak of ending his life." "Yes, sir. He'd been drinking more than usual." The responses followed predictable patterns, revealing nothing beyond what any observant servant might notice about a man's declining spirits. Sheriff Donovan recorded each statement in his leather-bound notebook, building a case for suicide, one mundane detail at a time. When Patience's turn came, she approached with the shuffling gait of someone accustomed to beatings, eyes fixed on the floor in the manner of a woman who had learned that invisibility meant survival. She clasped her hands in front of her apron, allowing them to tremble slightly, not from fear of discovery, but from the calculated display of nervousness that white folks expected from slaves under official scrutiny. The performance required delicate calibration. Too much fear would arouse suspicion. Too little would seem unnatural. "You ring the bell," Donovan stated rather than asked, consulting his notes. "Tell me about last night." Patience's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, pitched to suggest the mental limitations that white society insisted on attributing to enslaved people. "Yes, sir, I rings it at midnight, just like always. Master Edmund, he come up to check on me regular like. Real particular about the bell, he was." "Did he seem different last night? Upset about anything?" She paused as if struggling to formulate thoughts complex enough to answer the question, then shook her head slowly. "No, sir. Seemed like always. Maybe tired some. He'd been working powerful hard lately with the tobacco harvest and all." From the interview notes of Sheriff William Donovan, October 16, 1831. Slave woman Patience appears simple-minded but observant of master's routines. Claims nothing unusual about victim's behavior or demeanor during final encounter. Corroborates earlier testimony regarding deceased's recent melancholy. The sheriff pressed for details about the rope, the ladder, any unusual sounds or movements during the night. Patience answered each question with the careful consistency of someone telling the truth, because she was telling the truth selectively. Yes, the rope had been in good condition when she used it. No, she hadn't heard anything after Master Edmund left the tower. Yes, she had climbed down immediately after the midnight bell and returned to the quarters as always. What she didn't mention was the 20 minutes she had spent cleaning blood from under her fingernails where Edmund's desperate clawing had broken skin, or the careful way she had arranged the rope to suggest he had fashioned the noose himself, or the profound satisfaction she had felt watching the life drain from his eyes. Truth and deception danced together in her testimony like partners in an elaborate waltz. The other slaves watched this performance with faces carved from stone, giving away nothing of their own thoughts or suspicions. Some surely suspected what had really happened in that tower, but suspicion and knowledge were different things entirely, and even knowledge could be plausibly denied if the alternative was sharing a hangman's rope. The community of bondage had learned to protect itself through strategic ignorance and collective amnesia. Sheriff Donovan spent 3 hours questioning every person on the plantation, from the youngest field hand to old Moses, who had worked the Hartwell land for 40 years. The testimony painted a consistent picture. Master Edmund had grown increasingly troubled in recent weeks, drinking heavily and muttering about debts and decisions that weighed on his conscience. Several witnesses mentioned his recent harsh treatment of Samuel, suggesting that even he had begun to question the brutality required to maintain slave discipline. The devil's work requires no special tools. The investigation's focus gradually shifted from who might have killed Edmund Hartwell to why he might have killed himself. Financial records revealed mounting debts from poor tobacco yields and failed investments in railroad stock. Personal correspondence hinted at marital difficulties and concerns about his children's moral education in a household dependent on slave labor. The evidence for suicide accumulated like autumn leaves, obscuring any clear view of alternative explanations. But patients recognized the signs of a man beginning to suspect the truth. Sheriff Donovan's questions had grown more specific, more probing, as if he sensed inconsistencies in the neat suicide narrative. His eyes lingered on her face when she spoke, searching for tells that might betray deception. She knew that suspicion, once aroused, would continue growing until it found either proof or a more satisfying target. The next phase of the investigation would prove whether her performance could survive closer scrutiny, or whether the rope that had killed Master Edmund would soon be fashioned into a noose for her own neck. In a world where slaves could be executed on the flimsiest evidence, Patience understood that her life now depended on convincing a trained investigator that she lacked the intelligence, opportunity, and motivation to commit the perfect crime. The irony was exquisite. She had to prove her own inferiority to escape punishment for demonstrating her equality. Dr. James Fletcher's medical examination revealed details that transformed Sheriff Donovan's straightforward suicide case into something far more complex and disturbing. The corpse bore defensive wounds on the hands and arms where Edmund had clawed at the rope, but also strange bruising patterns around the throat that suggested the noose had been applied by someone else before the final drop, while the positioning of the body created mechanical impossibilities that no man could achieve while hanging himself. These forensic inconsistencies would either condemn an innocent slave or expose a killer who had planned the perfect murder with surgical precision. Fletcher was a Harvard-trained physician who had returned to Kentucky with modern ideas about scientific investigation, making him an unwelcome anomaly in a county that preferred simple explanations to complicated truths. His examination of Edmund's body took place in the Hartwell parlor, where he spread his instruments on Martha's finest tablecloth, while family members waited in adjoining rooms for confirmation of what they desperately wanted to believe, that their patriarch had chosen death over dishonor, sparing them the nightmare of admitting they had harbored a murderer. "The rope burns," Fletcher explained to Sheriff Donovan, "indicate the noose was tightened by external force before suspension. You see here?" He pointed to specific marks with clinical detachment. These patterns are consistent with manual strangulation, followed by hanging to disguise the true cause of death. Someone with considerable knowledge of anatomy and rope mechanics committed this crime. The implications sent tremors through the investigation, like fault lines spreading beneath solid ground. If Edmund Hartwell had been murdered, the killer possessed access to the bell tower, familiarity with his routines, and the physical strength to overpower a grown man. The suspect pool was smaller than anyone wanted to acknowledge, confined largely to family members and slaves who had both opportunity and motive for murder. Patients learned about the medical findings through the slave network that carried information faster than official channels. Ruth, who worked in the main house, overheard Fletcher's conversation with the sheriff and passed the news to Samuel, who whispered it to patients during evening prayers in the quarters. The forensic evidence was building a case that pointed directly towards someone in the enslaved community, and that someone needed to be sacrificed before the entire plantation faced collective punishment. From Dr. Fletcher's medical report, October 17, 1831, examination reveals victim was rendered unconscious through manual strangulation before being suspended from bell rope. Killer possessed detailed knowledge of human anatomy and demonstrated considerable physical strength. Recommend immediate investigation of all persons with access to deceased. The next morning brought a more intensive round of questioning as Sheriff Donovan focused on the physical evidence. Who had access to the bell tower? Who knew Edmund's inspection routines? Who possessed the strength necessary to overpower him? The questions grew more pointed more accusatory, as if the sheriff were preparing to move from investigation to arrest. Patience maintained her performance of bewildered submission, but cracks were beginning to show in the facade. Dr. Fletcher's clinical description of manual strangulation had shaken her more than she cared to admit, forcing her to confront the brutal reality of what she had done. In the heat of the moment, killing Edmund had felt like justice. Now, hearing her actions dissected with scientific precision, the act seemed more like vengeance, and vengeance was a luxury that slaves could not afford to indulge. The investigation began focusing on physical capabilities, with Sheriff Donovan examining each slave's hands for rope burns, scratches, or other evidence of struggle. Patience submitted to the inspection with apparent docility, her calloused palms revealing nothing beyond the expected wear from years of manual labor. She had been careful to treat the minor cuts from Edmund's fingernails with salt and lye, erasing evidence that might have betrayed her guilt to careful examination. But the net was tightening around the enslaved community as white anxiety demanded a culprit for crimes that threatened the fundamental order of plantation society. If slaves could murder their masters with impunity, what protection existed for any white family in the county? The investigation was becoming less about finding the truth and more about restoring confidence in a system built on terror and submission. Some secrets dig their own graves. Martha Hartwell added her own pressure to the investigation, insisting that one of her people had committed this heinous act. She couldn't accept that her husband might have chosen suicide over the burden of owning human beings, preferring to believe that savage ingratitude had motivated one of their slaves to murder the man who had provided them with food, shelter, and Christian instruction. Her grief transformed quickly into rage, and rage demanded blood in return for blood. The children, too young to understand the full implications, but old enough to sense the danger, watched the proceedings with the wide eyes of innocence, confronting evil. They had never questioned their right to own other human beings, accepting slavery as natural as sunrise, but their father's death forced them to confront the possibility that their property might also be their enemy. The plantation's atmosphere grew thick with suspicion and fear as white and black regarded each other across an abyss that seemed to widen with each passing hour. By evening, Sheriff Donovan had narrowed his focus to 3 suspects: Samuel, whose recent punishment provided clear motive; Moses, whose 40 years of experience had taught him every secret of the plantation; and Patience, whose access to the bell tower gave her unparalleled opportunity. One of them would hang before the week ended, and Patience knew that her performance in the final act would determine whether justice or injustice would claim the last victim in this tragedy. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and she prepared for the most crucial performance of her life. Sheriff Donovan's decision to conduct private interrogations in the plantation's tool shed created an atmosphere of calculated intimidation, where shadows from oil lamps danced against walls, lined with instruments that could serve equally for agriculture or torture. The scent of rust and wood oil, mixed with the lingering aroma of fear sweat from previous sessions, while outside the single window, darkness pressed against glass, like the weight of accumulated secrets demanding to be revealed. This final round of questioning would either establish Patience's innocence beyond doubt or provide Sheriff Donovan with the confession that would satisfy both justice and community expectations. Samuel entered first, his young shoulders still bearing the marks of Master Edmund's final punishment. Under intense questioning, he maintained his innocence with the desperate honesty of someone who understood that truth might not be sufficient to save his life. His alibi was solid. Other slaves could verify his presence in the quarters throughout the night, but alibis had never protected black men from white justice when convenient scapegoats were needed to restore social order. Old Moses followed, his 70 years and 3 missing fingers testament to a lifetime of enduring brutality with dignity intact. He answered questions with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate decades of white suspicion without losing his life or his sanity. His physical frailty made him an unlikely suspect for overpowering a grown man. But suspicion attached itself to the elderly slave community's collective memory of grievances that might motivate revenge. When Patience's turn came, she shuffled into the shed with the same submissive posture she had maintained throughout the investigation. The lamplight revealed her face in harsh detail. The premature lines carved by years of backbreaking labor, the downcast eyes that had learned never to meet white authority directly, the calloused hands that spoke of endless service to masters who considered her less than human. She was the perfect image of plantation slavery's ideal: broken, docile, incapable of independent thought or action. "Sit down," Donovan commanded, indicating a wooden stool positioned directly under the lamp where every expression would be clearly visible. "We're going to talk about what really happened in that tower." Patience lowered herself onto the stool with the careful movements of someone whose body had learned to expect pain from any interaction with white authority. She kept her eyes fixed on her hands, folded in her lap like broken wings, while her mind calculated every word she would need to speak to survive the next hour. The performance had to be perfect now. One false note would send her to the gallows alongside her victim. "You were the last person to see Master Edmund alive," Donovan began, his voice deliberately neutral. "Walk me through everything that happened after you rang the midnight bell." Her response came in the halting dialect that white folks expected from field slaves, each word carefully chosen to suggest limited intelligence while providing just enough information to satisfy his questions. She described Edmund's arrival in the tower, his routine inspection of the bell mechanism, his apparent satisfaction with her work before departing for his final rounds. Nothing in her testimony suggested anything beyond the mundane interaction between master and slave that had occurred countless times before. But Donovan had been studying her responses throughout the investigation, noting inconsistencies that only became apparent when viewed as a pattern. "You say he seemed normal," the sheriff pressed, "but others tell me he was drinking more lately. Seemed troubled. Surely you noticed something." From the final interrogation notes of Sheriff William Donovan, October 18th, 1831. Subject maintains consistent story despite repeated questioning. Claims limited observation of victim's mental state. Appears genuinely simple-minded, though displays unusual composure under pressure for one of her station. This was dangerous territory. Patience had to acknowledge what others had already testified, while avoiding any suggestion that she had paid particularly close attention to Edmund's behavior. "Master always seemed troubled to me, sir," she replied. "White folks got worries us, slaves don't understand. I just ring the bell like I've been told." The sheriff shifted tactics, focusing on technical details about the rope and pulley system. How had someone Edmund's size managed to hang himself from that particular beam? What knowledge of mechanics would have been required? Patience responded to each question with the bewildered incomprehension of someone genuinely confused by concepts beyond her limited experience. "I don't know nothing about how ropes work, sir," she said when pressed about the mechanics of suicide. "I just pull the bell rope like Master taught me. Don't think about how it all fits together." Her performance was masterful, but Donovan sensed something artificial in her responses. Perhaps it was the way she never quite met his eyes, or the calculated precision of her ignorance, or simply the instinct that told him the most obvious suspect was often the guilty party. He began applying pressure, designed to crack even the most carefully constructed facade. "Dr. Fletcher says whoever killed Master Edmund knew exactly what they were doing," he stated flatly. "This wasn't some crime of passion. It was planned, calculated, executed by someone with real intelligence. Someone like you, perhaps? Death rides on the wings of truth." Patience allowed herself a moment of genuine confusion, as if the suggestion that she possessed intelligence was more shocking than any accusation of murder. "Sir, I can't hardly read my own name. How I gonna plan something like that?" "I just do what I've been told, same as always." The denial rang true because it contained an essential truth. She couldn't read her own name, having learned literacy in secret using biblical passages and her own carefully chosen identity. The sheriff was looking for a calculating killer, but Patience had hidden her intelligence so successfully that even trained investigators couldn't detect it beneath layers of performance perfected over decades. "Then explain this," Donovan said, producing a small piece of paper from his coat. "We found this hidden in your quarters." Patience's heart stopped, but her face showed only puzzlement as she examined the paper. It contained a crude drawing of the bell tower, with marks that could represent rope positions, possibly evidence of premeditation that would damn her beyond any hope of salvation. The sheriff watched her reaction carefully, looking for the telltale signs of recognition that would confirm his suspicions. But Patience had never seen this paper before in her life, and her genuine confusion was more convincing than any performance could have been. "Don't know what that is, sir," she said honestly. "Can't make sense of it." Donovan studied her face under the harsh lamplight, searching for deception and finding only bewilderment. Either she was the most accomplished actress he had ever encountered, or someone else had planned Edmund Hartwell's murder with meticulous care. The investigation was reaching its climax, and the sheriff had to decide whether to arrest a woman who might be innocent or release a killer who had committed the perfect crime. The moment balanced on a knife's edge between justice and injustice, with Patience's life hanging in the balance like a body from a bell tower rope. The paper that would determine Patience's fate lay spread across Sheriff Donovan's makeshift desk like a roadmap to the gallows. Its crude sketches of the bell tower speaking in a language that could either condemn an innocent woman or expose the real architect of Edmund Hartwell's demise. The lamp flame flickered against autumn wind that rattled the shed's wooden walls, while outside in the darkness, the entire plantation held its breath, waiting for a judgment that would either restore order or plunge the community deeper into chaos. This moment would reveal whether justice could coexist with slavery, or whether the system itself made truth impossible to determine when black lives hung in the balance. Dr. Fletcher's unexpected arrival interrupted the interrogation at precisely the moment when Patience's composure was beginning to crack under sustained pressure. He burst through the shed door carrying his medical bag and an expression of urgent discovery, transforming the atmosphere from methodical investigation to crisis management. "Sheriff, I need to speak with you immediately. There's been a development." The two men stepped outside, leaving Patience alone with the incriminating evidence and her racing thoughts. Through the thin walls, she could hear fragments of heated conversation. Found in the main house, Martha Hartwell's handwriting, suicide note hidden in. The words came in pieces, but their implications struck her like lightning, illuminating a landscape she had never suspected existed. When they returned, Sheriff Donovan's demeanor had shifted completely. The hard edge of suspicion had been replaced by something approaching embarrassment, as if he had been caught pursuing shadows while the truth lay hidden in plain sight. He gathered up the mysterious paper and his interrogation notes with movements that suggested the entire investigation had taken an unexpected turn. "You can go," he told Patience curtly. "Return to your quarters and speak of this to no one." She rose from the stool with the same careful movements she had used throughout the interrogation. But her mind reeled with questions about what Dr. Fletcher had discovered in the main house. A suicide note in Martha Hartwell's handwriting? Had the grieving widow fabricated evidence to frame one of her slaves, or had she hidden her husband's final words to protect his reputation? The truth seemed to shift like quicksand beneath every assumption. From the amended sheriff's report, October 19, 1831, investigation concluded following discovery of suicide note concealed in victim's personal effects. Letter confirms deceased's intention to end his life due to financial difficulties and moral conflicts regarding slave ownership. All suspects released without charges. The official conclusion satisfied everyone's need for closure while raising questions that would never be answered. Edmund Hartwell had taken his own life, overcome by debts and conscience in equal measure. The bell rope had been his instrument of choice, the tower his final refuge from a world that demanded he profit from human misery while maintaining his Christian principles. Justice had been served by his own hand, sparing the community the nightmare of confronting uncomfortable truths about the relationship between slavery and violence. But Patience knew better. She had felt Edmund's life drain away beneath her fingers, had watched his eyes lose their light as the rope tightened around his throat. No suicide note could change the reality of what she had done in that tower, though she began to understand that truth and official truth were different creatures entirely. Someone had decided that her version of events was too dangerous to acknowledge, too threatening to the social order that kept white families safe in their beds. Walking back to the quarters through air thick with autumn mist, Patience felt the weight of secrets that would accompany her to the grave. She had committed the perfect crime and escaped punishment through circumstances beyond her control or understanding. Whether Martha Hartwell had forged evidence to protect her husband's reputation, or Edmund had actually written a confession before climbing to his death, the result was the same. Patience would live to see another day. The enslaved community greeted her return with carefully neutral expressions that revealed nothing of their thoughts or suspicions. Some surely knew or guessed what had really happened in the bell tower, but knowledge was dangerous, cargo that could sink entire communities if discovered by white authority. They welcomed her back with the same protective silence that had shielded runaway slaves and hidden rebellion for generations. Samuel approached her after evening prayers, his young face etched with questions he dared not voice aloud. "Sister Patience," he whispered, "you all right? They treat you decent in there?" She nodded, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder where the whip marks were finally beginning to heal. "I'm fine, Samuel. We all fine now." The words carried multiple meanings, spoken in the coded language that allowed slaves to communicate truth without revealing dangerous secrets. Edmund Hartwell was dead. The investigation was closed, and they had survived another crisis that could have destroyed them all. But survival came with costs that would accumulate like compound interest over the years to come. Patience had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, transforming herself from victim to killer in the space of a single night. The knowledge would live in her bones like a fever that never quite broke, a constant reminder that justice sometimes required becoming the very monster that society claimed she already was. The bell tower stood empty that night, and for many nights to come, its rope cut down and burned as evidence of tragedy too painful to preserve. A new bell ringer would be appointed eventually, someone untainted by association with death and rebellion, but the tower itself would always carry the memory of what had happened there. Local folklore would grow around the place, whispered stories of ghostly figures and strange sounds that warned sensitive souls away from climbing those ladder rungs after dark. Some say that on certain autumn nights, when the wind is just right and the moon hangs like a pearl against dark water, you can still hear the echo of 13 bell tolls coming from that empty tower. The final count that marked not just the hour of Edmund Hartwell's death, but the moment when one enslaved woman chose her own definition of justice over the mercy that had never been offered to her people. 3 months after Edmund Hartwell's death, the plantation sold at auction to settle debts that had accumulated like autumn leaves around his legacy of Christian slavery and financial incompetence. The morning air carried the sharp scent of wood smoke from cooking fires and the metallic tang of fear as 18 human beings stood in the main yard waiting to learn their fate, while auctioneers arranged them like livestock according to age, strength, and estimated market value. The day would scatter the enslaved community across 3 states, breaking bonds forged in shared suffering and protective silence that had shielded them all from the consequences of one woman's perfect crime. Patience stood in the front row with the other prime field hands, her body appraised like machinery by men who calculated her remaining years of productivity with the cold precision of accountants. At 38, she represented a solid investment. Strong enough for heavy labor, experienced enough to train younger slaves, old enough to be unlikely to attempt escape to free territory. The bidding for her services would be spirited among planters seeking to expand their human property holdings. Martha Hartwell watched from the main house porch, dressed in black mourning clothes that emphasized her pale complexion and tragic circumstances. She had orchestrated this sale with the same efficiency she had once applied to managing household slaves, determining that maintaining the plantation alone was beyond her capabilities as a widow with 4 children to raise. The money would pay Edmund's debts and provide modest security for his family, while the slaves would become someone else's moral burden. Samuel was sold first, his youth and literacy making him valuable, despite the recent whipping that had marked him as potentially troublesome. A cotton planter from Mississippi paid $400 for the privilege of owning a young man whose crime had been learning to write his own name. As he was led away in chains, Samuel caught Patience's eye one final time, his expression carrying gratitude for lessons in courage that would serve him wherever bondage might take him. Old Moses went to a local tobacco farm, where his experience with Kentucky growing conditions outweighed concerns about his advanced age. Ruth was purchased by a family in Tennessee who needed an experienced house slave familiar with fine cooking and delicate laundry. One by one, the community that had protected Patience's secret was dismantled and dispersed, their shared knowledge scattered like seeds on hostile ground. From the Jessamine County auction records, January 22, 1832. Negro woman Patience, age 38, sold to Captain James Morrison of Harrison County for the sum of $750. Described as strong field hand with experience in household duties and bell ringing. Captain Morrison was a practical man who had heard rumors about the Hartwell plantation's troubles, but cared only about acquiring productive workers for his expanding tobacco operation. He examined Patience with the same attention he might give to purchasing a horse, checking her teeth, testing the strength of her grip, asking pointed questions about her work history and any history of rebellion or escape attempts. The inspection was thorough but impersonal, reducing her to a collection of useful attributes and potential problems. "She ring bells, you say?" Morrison asked the auctioneer, consulting his notes about her previous duties. "Yes, sir. 3 years' experience with the chapel bell. Very reliable, never missed a tolling." Morrison nodded approvingly. His own plantation chapel needed a bell ringer, and training slaves for specialized duties took time he preferred to spend on more profitable activities. "Any trouble with her? Running off, talking back, that sort of thing?" "No, sir. Quiet as a church mouse. Never gave the Hartwells a moment's worry." The irony of that assessment was not lost on Patience, who maintained her submissive posture while inwardly marveling at how completely she had hidden her true nature from everyone who claimed to know her. She had killed her master with careful planning and flawless execution, escaped investigation through superior acting, and now stood being praised for her docility by men who remained ignorant of her capabilities. The sale concluded with handshakes and paperwork that transferred ownership of human beings as casually as livestock or farming equipment. Patience was loaded into a wagon with 3 other newly purchased slaves, her hands bound not from suspicion, but from routine precaution against escape attempts during transport. As the wagon rolled away from the only home she had known since childhood, she watched the bell tower recede into the distance like a monument to secrets that would die with her. Captain Morrison's plantation operated on principles similar to the Hartwell estate, but with greater efficiency and stricter discipline. The quarters were better built, the food more adequate, the work schedules more demanding. Morrison believed that well-maintained slaves were more productive slaves, a philosophy that resulted in longer life expectancy and higher profits without fundamentally altering the moral mathematics of human bondage. Patience adapted to her new circumstances with the same careful observation that had served her so well in planning Edmund's murder. She learned Morrison's routines, his preferences, his weaknesses, storing information with the unconscious precision of someone who understood that knowledge was the only weapon slaves could safely accumulate. But this time, she used her intelligence for survival rather than revenge, having learned that murder was a luxury she could afford only once. The chapel bell at Morrison's plantation tolled under her hands for 15 years, calling the faithful to worship while she stood in the tower thinking about justice, memory, and the weight of secrets that grew heavier with time. She never spoke of what had happened at the Hartwell plantation, never hinted at the knowledge she carried about the true cause of Edmund's death. The perfect crime remained perfect through perfect silence. Blood always finds its own level. When the Civil War finally came to Kentucky in 1861, Captain Morrison fled to Confederate territory rather than face the possibility of emancipation destroying his investment in human property. Federal troops occupied the plantation, offering freedom to any slaves who wished to claim it. At 58, Patience walked away from bondage with nothing but the clothes on her back and 30 years of accumulated wisdom about surviving in a world that had never intended her to be free. She settled in Louisville, taking work as a washerwoman and living quietly in a community of former slaves who understood the value of asking no questions about each other's past. Sometimes, late at night, when the city grew quiet, she could hear church bells tolling the hours across the river, and the sound would carry her back to a tower where she had chosen justice over mercy and changed the course of her own story with rope and determination. The official records show that Edmund Hartwell died by suicide on October 15, 1831, overcome by financial difficulties and moral conflicts regarding slave ownership. The investigation was thorough, the evidence conclusive, the case closed to everyone's satisfaction. No mention was made of Patience's role in the proceedings, because the perfect crime leaves no evidence beyond the satisfaction of justice finally served. But in certain quarters of Louisville, among women who had escaped bondage through their own courage and cunning, stories were told about a slave who had found freedom through a bell tower rope and the patience to wait 37 years for the perfect moment to strike. The stories grew in the telling, becoming legend, becoming myth, becoming a reminder that justice sometimes wears the face of the oppressed and speaks with the voice of those who were never supposed to have voices at all. They say that even now, when the wind is right and the moon hangs low over Kentucky tobacco fields, you can hear 13 tolls echoing across the darkness, not marking the hour, but counting the years of bondage that ended with one woman's decision to choose her own definition of freedom. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.